Will you pray with me? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Jesus has risen from the dead. He's appeared to Mary Magdalene in the garden. It's evening of the same day, and the 10 disciples are gathered behind locked doors. They are frightened for their own lives, and they're grieving the loss of Jesus. They've heard the acclamation of Mary, but they still are in a bit of disbelief. And then suddenly Jesus appears to them. Jesus comes among them and offers them peace. He shows them his wounded hands and feet and side. He brings the Holy Spirit to them, and then he sends them out to bless and forgive others. Certainly, these men must have been overwhelmed by the presence of the Holy Spirit. And now these 10 disciples have faith and they believe. When the missing disciple Thomas arrives, the disciples excitedly tell him about the appearance of Jesus. But Thomas does not believe. The first-hand witness account of all the other disciples and the women is not sufficient for Thomas to have faith. Thomas needs to see for himself. The ensuing week must have been a hard one for Thomas. I can imagine that he was pressured a lot by the others to believe. There must have been much discussion about what they should all be doing next, where they should go, who they should tell, what was safe. And what exactly was the message? What exactly was it that Jesus was sending them out to do? Should they return to their previous occupations, fishing, farming, tax collecting? And throughout the week of conversations, there must have always been the doubting and questioning voice of Thomas. How could they help Thomas? And then Jesus comes again and stands among them. This time Thomas is there, and Jesus invites Thomas to put his fingers in the wound in his hands and to touch the wound in his side. Now Thomas gets it and believes. But Jesus speaks a blessing to all those who have not seen and yet believed. A few weeks later, we find Peter speaking to a crowd gathered in Jerusalem. It's the eve of Pentecost, or 50 days after the Passover. 50 days, 7 weeks after the death and resurrection of Jesus. In those 7 weeks, Peter has found his voice and already begun to proclaim his faith. This from a man who recently denied ever knowing Jesus. Peter has done quite a turnaround. And as he speaks this day, the mission to evangelize the world has begun. On this day, Peter addresses fellow Jews and Israelites who know and understand Jewish law and heritage and tradition. He speaks to some of the very people who helped to crucify Jesus. He does not condemn them or berate them for what they did, but he can already see that it was all part of God's plan to demonstrate God's power over death. And I'm sure that Peter has forgiven the people for their shouts of crucify him, because he has also had to forgive himself for his denial of Jesus. I imagine that Peter now understands all the stories that Jesus ever spoke about forgiveness and about being lost and being found. And now Peter proclaims Jesus as raised by God and proclaims that Jesus is the fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecy, and that all that has happened according to God's plan and knowledge. Never been easy to be a Christian. In the first century especially, Christianity was a small Jewish sect without power or consequence in a larger pagan or Roman world. Christians, like Jews, were laughed at, scorned, ignored, persecuted, and put to death rather frequently. Living the moral and loving life taught by Jesus has never been easy. It has always been a struggle to remain faithful to God and Jesus in the midst of a popular culture that promotes other values and other ways of living. It is into the midst of this kind of struggle to remain faithful that Peter writes a letter from which we read this morning. Many of the new converts are having a hard time remaining faithful. They are suffering and being persecuted. Peter writes to remind them of the great gift they have in Jesus Christ. He reminds them of the new birth into hope that we have in the resurrection of Jesus, and that because of Jesus, we are promised an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, that is kept for us in heaven. Peter also writes of God's protection and that our faith is more precious than gold. Peter is writing to encourage the people to remain faithful and moral and loving, even though they suffer many trials. Peter also praises them for coming to faith, though they have not seen Jesus, and that the outcome of faith is salvation. So here we are, 2,000 years later. Millions of faithful Christians have come and died before us. We have not put our fingers into the wounds of Jesus's hands and feet inside. We have not even had the benefit of firsthand witness accounts by meeting face to face with Peter or James or John or the other disciples. We only have written testimony in what we call the Bible of the people who knew the disciples, or other words, written testimony of witnesses to the first witnesses. And beyond that, we have tradition handed down to us by those millions of faithful who come before us. How do we come to believe? That's what these passages are all about. Do you come to believe because somebody told you to believe? Do you come to believe because you grew up learning a set of creeds or doctrines that you were told you needed to ascribe to so you could go to heaven? Or he gets a bum rap. Are you more like Thomas? Do you believe because you touch? And maybe you have touched pain, suffering, wounds. Do you believe from a firsthand experience, or do you believe because somebody told you about it? And I'm not saying either one is right or wrong. Most of our church experience doesn't tell us that that whole story that John has down is because there's a big conflict going on about whether we are going to believe like John, that we have to believe in this light from God, this Jesus, like it says there in that John 3:16, God sent his only son into the world. And if we believe, we'll all, have eternal life. And that's all that's necessary. Because there's another thread going down and following Thomas in this world, back there in that first century, which is all about the light is in every one of us. The Holy Spirit is in every one of us. And we come to know this by our firsthand touching experience in the ways in which we touch the divine. There's a huge conflict in those early years in the church, and John won out. And so that's what got handed down in all those years in the church. And then finally the church writes all those creeds, and the church took a certain set of texts that supported John and made that the canon. And the church totally ignored another whole set of tradition and writing. Did you know that? Those who followed in what became known as the Thomist tradition. As far as tradition is concerned, they say that Thomas actually took the gospel all the way to India. And there are, to this day, churches in India known as Thomist churches or Thomist Christians who followed in his way. All the writings of all the other people who wrote about the early years of Christianity got buried for almost 2,000 years until they were discovered, most of them at a place called Nag Hammadi. Have any of you ever heard that? Some of you, I know Ed's heard about Nag Hammadi. And that there are other gospels that were written. There's the gospel according to Thomas and his experience of how he knew God and how he knew Jesus and how he understood this message. I would encourage you, there's a wonderful book that was written about 20 years ago called Beyond Belief by Elaine Pagels, which is about the gospel according to Thomas. So it's a really good, very nice read. Very, very nice read. I would highly recommend, if you're on a spiritual journey, you might want to pick this one up and realize that there's more than one way up the mountain. And that's what I'd like to challenge you to be thinking about. How do you get up the mountain? I guess I have to admit that in my own inner self, I'm probably much more of a Thomist Christian than I am a Johannine Christian. I've never really resonated much with the Gospel of John. If anything, I've resonated more with the other synoptic Gospels. but I have definitely spent my 74 years knowing God by touch. And no matter what I have ever read, and all that theology they made me study when I was at Yale, and all the papers they made me write, I always had to end every theological treatise I ever wrote. I could argue all those points from all those people, but the bottom line is it had to come back. It had to resonate with what I had experienced in my own being as to who God was, the love of God that I had experienced in my life, the divine something more that I had experienced in my life. And the two ways I've experienced it the most, I've experienced it in what I would call awe. And I hope you're all open to awe. Awe is what happens on a dark night when you look at the stars and you know how infinitely small you are in this larger scheme of things. That's awe. Awe is sometimes in sunsets or in staring at the intricacy of a snowflake that lands on your mitten and you can see every little bit of the crystal in its awesomeness. Awe is looking at wonderful spring color blossoming out everywhere. Awe is in the little bird that chirps at me in the morning when I walk the dogs. There's lots of awe in this world. I have to experience awe. And the other place that I experienced God the most has probably been in the midst of suffering. That's Thomas touching the wounds. Some of it's been my own trials and tribulations that I know some power greater than me saw me through it. Or it's been there as I have been privileged to be at that fine edge between life and death. You all know that I did a lot of hospital work and a lot of work with people with AIDS. I stopped counting after I had sat there 500 times. But when you are in the midst of death, when you are there in that awesome moment, it is overwhelmingly powerful to know something here that is bigger and more awesome than me. And I don't know any of that because I read Karl Barth or Karl Rahner or any of those other people they made me read. That's just my life. Each one of us needs to find our own way up the mountain. And whatever works for you is good. What I encourage you is to find a way up the mountain. I think a lot of what happens in our world is people get turned off by churches that fight with each other and argue with each other, hurt people. And we have turned off millions of people to wanting anything to do with the way. America now has more people who say none in response to religion than there are people who will claim any kind of religion. And I find that sad, that we've turned people off. We all just need to be on the journey. Thomas was on a journey. And Thomas wasn't afraid to touch pain and suffering, to touch wounds. But all of them, each in their own way, came to know something that was indeed awesome and life-changing. So I would pray for all of you this day that you will be on a journey and that you will find something in your life, something here in this Glade family, something in what you read, something in the stars at night, some power in the midst of the pain of your life that will move you on a journey to know the awesomeness of the more. Amen.